booked and banned. Come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome, listeners, to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. Today, we will be talking about D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, the original gangsta 50 Shades of Grey. I do want to do a note before we start. The conversation may be a little unfiltered today because there's adult language in the original text. And so we're not going to gloss over that at all. If you do have little ones around or you're listening at work, you might want to grab your headphones or save it for another time. So, Amy, thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Naomi.
Tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and what your connection is to literature.
Sure. Thanks, Naomi. It's always good to see you, and I'm really glad to be here and honored that you invited me. I'm executive editor of a scholarly journal of literary criticism called SEL Studies in English Literature, 1500 to 1900. That's going into its 65th year of publications. It's very prominent globally. And I'm also a professor of English literature at Rice University in Houston, Texas. My training is primarily in 19th century British literature and culture, what we usually call the Victorian period, or what your listeners might be familiar with as the Victorian period. So for those who are listening and maybe less familiar with those texts, you might think of Dickens. Charles Dickens, for example, is very prominently, or George Eliot, like Middlemarch. So those are very prominent. But also my areas of specialty have to do with poetry. So Tennyson is somebody that many people recognize, The Lady of Shalott, or it's being quoted in like James Bond films, for example, that kind of thing. So Tennyson's very prominent. So that's the time period I look at. To make it even more simple, it's about 200 years ago, roughly, is when it started in 1837. So I work on questions of gender, sexuality, social constraint, and the ways literature registers cultural pressure points, and I regularly teach undergraduate and graduate courses on these subjects. And I want to be upfront for your listeners that I'm not a D.H. Lawrence specialist. I don't claim expertise in his work at all. What I do bring, though, is a long view of British literary culture, especially how ideas about sex, marriage, class, and moral obligation evolve over time. Lady Chatterley's Lover, though, is actually a 20th century novel, but it deeply engaged with the moral structures Lawrence inherited from the 19th century because he was born in 1885, I believe. And so he was a Victorian child, but he wrote these novels and actually died before Lady Chatterley's Lover was officially published. But anyway, that's the angle I'm coming from, is sort of deep expertise about the era he grew up in and what he might have been responding to. And then the legal issues that sprang up around this book, which are also of interest to me, because before I became a college professor, I was a paralegal for 15 years. So, and since your podcast is called Booked and Banned, I think the legal and the banning aspect of this book is especially relevant.
Yeah, thank you so much. So before we dive into the conversation, let's give our listeners a little bit of context about the book. It was first published in 1928, and the story follows Constance, frequently referred to as Connie in the text, Constance Chatterley, a young woman married to a wealthy aristocrat, Sir Clifford Chatterley. After Clifford returns from World War I, paralyzed from the waist down, he retreats into a life of cold intellectualism and obsession with his coal mines, which is the family business, leaving Connie emotionally isolated and physically unfulfilled. Desperate to escape the reality of her marriage and the gloom of Ragby Hall Estate, and we could have a whole conversation about why this place was called Ragby, though that started with a W. Connie encounters Oliver Mellors. He's the estate's kind of brooding gameskeeper. He's suffering from his own demons over his military service in Egypt and India. Yeah, so what begins as a search for a physical connection evolves into a passionate, tender, and for the time, very radical love affair. The relationship is a double transgression. It is not only adulterous, but it violates rigid British class boundaries. Connie, a lady of high society, falls in love with a man from the near subsistence working class. The novel contrasts Clifford's rigid worldview with the vitality and naturalism of Miller's and Connie's connection. Eventually, the affair is revealed. Connie is pregnant and decides to leave her aristocratic life behind. The novel ends on an uncertain but hopeful note, with the lovers separated by circumstance, but planning to divorce their respective spouses and start a new life together. So the plot of this novel was not the only issue. It was also the execution. And some of the reasons that this book was banned was the explicit language. Lawrence used unprintable, quote unquote, unprintable 4-letter words, specifically regarding anatomy and sexual acts in a literary context, which was unheard of at the time. The descriptions of sex were not merely suggestive, they were explicit, sometimes using slang, sometimes using anatomical terms, celebrating the physical act as a spiritual experience. The book was officially banned in the US and the UK for decades, though pirated copies circulated in both countries. Copies discovered by customs agents were confiscated and allegedly destroyed.
Allegedly, they probably took them home and read them.
I'm sure they did.
Yeah.
Or their wives did,
Yeah.
For the next 30 years, the only legal versions available were heavily expurgated or expurgated. I can't even say that word.
Yeah. Actually, if I could just adjust something
Go for
slightly,
it.
the 1928 publication wasn't actually a publication. It was only privately circulated in Coterie. And it was 2 years before he died. So there was only an authorized edition published in 1932, 2 years after he died, so posthumously. And that was quite a bit expurgated already. So I was going to get into this later, but So it's got a very weird publication history because of its content.
And then to top it all off, there was a 1960 obscenity trial in the United Kingdom, which became like this cultural watershed moment, effectively ending strict literary censorship in Britain. So now that we have a little bit of background, Amy, tell me why this book speaks to you and why you chose it.
Yeah, actually, the main reason I chose Lady Chatterley's lover name is exactly what you talk about, that watershed moment in the history of free expression. It's that when we call Lawrence's novel a banned book, it's really one that still shapes how we argue about banned books today. It really ranks among one of the banned books. And by that, I mean one that resulted in lawsuits and established precedent for what obscenity was and what banned books were. And so I think if you're starting off a podcast as you are kicking things off, looking at these books that were actually put on trial effectively is really important. So you've covered some of this already, but when Penguin Books published the unexpurgated edition in 1960, it was only after this British trial that put it to a crucial question, which was, could a work be defended on the grounds of literary merit or public good? So that was the question. Actually, I would say that in quotation marks, a literary merit or public good. So that was the legal test that the book had to go up against. And Penguin actually called major literary and intellectual figures to testify on behalf of this book. So it was like the book was a criminal that was being put on trial. So Forrester, Helen Gardner, and Raymond Williams were among the writers that came and testified and argued that this was a serious novel engaging with questions of marriage, class, embodiment, and modern life. So in November of 1960, the jury returned a not guilty verdict, allowing the novel to be openly sold and distributed in Britain for the first time more than 30 years after it was written in its unexpurgated form. So that verdict alone affirmed that literature has to be judged as a whole and that offense alone isn't sufficient grounds for suppression, which I think is really, really important. And I want to say something more about that. Like, offense alone isn't sufficient grounds to ban a book. Public good does not mean universal comfort. It means value for the public and all of its diversity. And that principle still matters today when books like the graphic novel Drama are challenged or removed from school libraries. So for those who don't know this book, it's a graphic novel about middle schoolers who are essentially exploring or learning about their sexuality and emerging identity, including queer identity. And some readers have objected to that content, including in the state where I currently live. But for other members of the public, especially young people who rarely see themselves and their identities represented in these ways, these books have real value. So that was the through line for me. Like Lady Chatterley and its trial wasn't saying everyone has to like this book or accept or appreciate the language or want to expose themselves to sexually explicit language. It was saying that disagreement is not the same thing as harm, and that literature's public good lies precisely in its ability to speak differently to different lives. So, in that sense, this novel matters to me, not just in a historical sense, but it's a reminder that freedom to read depends on resisting the ideas that one group's discomfort gets to determine what everyone else is allowed to encounter. And so when you asked me what book I wanted to pick, this was the first one that came to mind. Because it's like, you don't get to dictate what other people read and expose themselves to. That is not one person's like obligation or right to do that. And even these trials and governments, legislation, laws have said that a public good has to be for everyone's public good. So again, this book really for me reminds us that disagreement is not the same thing as harm, and that the freedom to read depends on resisting the idea that one person being harmed or uncomfortable gets to decide what everyone else reads. So that was a huge reason to pick it.
It's an
Yeah.
excellent reason.
Well, thank you. I was really excited when you asked me it. I was like, the first book that came to my mind was this one.
No,
Like
excellent.
we talk about this trial in a course I teach called Sex and the City. It has no Carrie Bradshaw in it. But it's about the co-constitutive influences of sexuality and urbanization. And we talk about this trial specifically to think about the point that, just because you're offended by something or it makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean that it doesn't have some value for someone else and
you don't have to read it.
That's right. You don't have to expose yourself, or if you have a child and you don't want them exposed to that, make that decision for your child, but not for everybody's child.
Right.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So when Lawrence wrote the novel, essentially a generation after Queen Victoria had died, and here you are, a scholar of the Victorian era and English literature more generally. Do you see this book as signaling the end of Victorian repression, or is Lawrence fighting a ghost that was very much alive in the 1920s?
Oh, yes, absolutely. He's very much fighting something that was still alive. Victorian moral frameworks didn't vanish with Victoria's death. She died in 1902, but moral frameworks don't disappear on a schedule. So ideas about sexual restraint and marital duty, respectability were embedded in law, publishing, and social life well into the 20th century, and in some cases still exist with a lot of people. Lawrence isn't writing, although he isn't writing during the Victorian period proper, which ended with Victoria's death in 1902, he's responding to its afterlife for sure. I really appreciated your language of ghosts there because, they are these sort of things that hover around still. The legal systems that censored literature, the conventions of what could be named, the language that can be used, the assumption that silence was moral as opposed to speaking a thing, that world was still very much in force. So at the same time, I would say rather than declaring some sort of victory over Victorian repression, I'd say Lawrence is exposing how persistent it was, even in this supposedly modern age where, I know you've encountered this and I have two people object even to profanity now sometimes.
Yeah, well, and I think we still have this kind of hangover from Victorian morality. And, because if you read like Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, which was pre-Victoria, there was this whole different, I guess, social system around. He had a bastard who was openly acknowledged. He had an illegitimate son, openly acknowledged, who became the governor of Pennsylvania. It was not a detriment, and nobody, held it against him that his parents weren't married. And so we seem to have like forgotten that our sexual mores, as a society, or at least as a European, Western sort of descended society, were a lot more free in some ways than during the Victorian age and even since then. Yeah, I mean, I still feel like that prudishness is there sometimes.
Yeah, I think there's a whole side conversation we could be having about changes in religion and religious observance during that time, for sure. And some of the ways that the Protestantism has its holdover still in the United States. For certain. But, it depends on the family and the person, of course. But yes, all of that is to agree with you, yes.
So, Victorian novels often featured cross class romance, but
Yeah.
usually with the sort of Cinderella dynamic or tragic consequences.
Yeah.
So how does the relationship between Connie and Oliver disrupt this traditional Victorian narrative of class? Is Lawrence rewriting the rules of the marriage plot?
Yeah, actually, I would say yes, to an extent. So Victorian novels, you're right, do sometimes feature these class relationships, but they're usually absorbed back into the social order. In fact, some scholars have argued that is the very point of the marriage plot, that the person that is sort of an outlier gets absorbed back into the social order through marriage, inheritance, or like forms of moral correction. Most famous example, of course, is Pride and Prejudice, where Elizabeth Bennet comes from the landed gentry and Darcy comes from the aristocracy. And I've got a chart, which I can't share with you here, but that actually breaks down what his income is on an annual basis, and it's in the multi-millions. Like he's, somebody that would be considered maybe almost a billionaire now. Well, the Bennets are, not poor. They are a family of five, but the equivalent of what the father brings in on an annual basis is about $70,000 or $80,000 a year. So they're solidly middle class, but for five people, that's still a budget that's stretched, essentially. And so for her to go from that to marrying someone who's like a billionaire is, you mentioned 50 Shades of Grey. I'm like, maybe it's more like Christian Grey. Actually, Darcy is more like marrying Christian Grey. But anyway, so there's a critic at Stanford, literary critic, Franco Moretti, who's argued that social compromise is actually the mechanism that makes the 19th century marriage plot work. So Elizabeth has to revise her assumptions about Darcy, and Darcy has to revise his sense of rank and entitlement in order for the two of them to come together. Doing that makes the system bend just enough to preserve itself, basically. What Lawrence is doing differently, though, is he's refusing that logic. Connie doesn't negotiate her way to a more humane version of aristocratic marriage. She doesn't just stay put and do her duty and grit her teeth. She doesn't reform the system from within, trying to figure out a way to quietly have sex on the side or anything like that, even though that's originally what her husband asked her to do. He says, well, if you can provide me with an heir and do it discreetly, I would raise the child. So instead, Lady Chatterley's lever is about a refusal to compromise. It's about opting out of that social order that defines moral success as adjustment or bending oneself rather than transformation. So that's what makes the relationship with Mellors probably unsettling for some readers in that era, maybe in ours. He isn't a project for her, and she isn't reforming him.
Right.
Their connection doesn't resolve their class difference or stabilize the hierarchy between them. And it's like she doesn't make him one of her people, and he doesn't bring her down to his level, really. She's still Lady Chatterley. So their relationship really exposes how fragile those structures are when intimacy and sort of connection between two people refuses to play by social rules. So I think Lawrence definitely has created sort of an anti-marriage plot novel here.
Well, and he kind of flips the genders because, in most sentimental novels, it's always a young woman who is either, she's in an unprotected position. So she's either taken advantage of by someone in the aristocracy or who's in a higher class than she is, or she's elevated, and does make that adjustment into the aristocracy. And in this case, we have the woman is in the aristocracy, but you're right. They're not making the same adjustment. But usually in these sentimental novels, the woman is in the lower class position and not the upper class position. And when it does end tragically, it's like she becomes a prostitute or whatever. And it's even more degraded.
Then it's a fallen woman story, which is its own genre of novels in the 19th century, because there's, if the marriage doesn't come, and actually, just to go back to Pride and Prejudice again, that is one of the crises in that novel is when Lydia Bennet, Lizzie's younger sister, runs away with a man, and he's going to take advantage of her and have sex with her and abandon her. But Darcy goes to the rescue and basically pays the guy off to marry her. To prevent her from having that fallen woman's narrative, which would also have tainted all the other sisters.
Yes.
So, yes, but in Lawrence's novel, Connie's the one going to Mellors. She's the one attracted to him and seeking him out. And when she does that initially, he's like, my lady, this is not this puts me in danger, and she wants what she wants. So, which is a brief way of saying she wants what she wants. So, I gotta say, have you seen the 2022 version that came out?
I
It's
have
excellent.
not.
It's excellent. It has Emma Corrin, who plays Princess Diana in The Crown. It has her as Connie, and then Jack O'Connell, who's a really excellent but lesser known actor, plays Milors. He's British also, and he's been in a number of films. Like he was in Godless as a miniseries on Netflix, but it's I think the best version of it I've seen. It's really well done, and because it was done in 2022, they can be, a little bit more direct with the sexuality on screen, but also the relationship that Emma Corrin and I can't remember his name. It's super easy. Jack O'Connell. So Corrin and O'Connell have really good chemistry on screen. That's not like smoldering necessarily, but like definitely you could see these two people being madly in love with each other. So it's excellent. I highly recommend. It's really
Yeah.
well done, and it does follow the text. And they picked a super annoying husband for her. Like you don't want her to go find someone else. Like, yeah, he's like Clifford Chatterley's a real pain in the ass in that film.
Well,
So,
he's the
yeah.
pain in the ass in the book,
Yeah, he really takes advantage of her goodness. Like she tries and you want to root for her. You want her to be able to have this happy marriage. And when they get married, she loves him. Like, and so she, gave it the old stiff upper lip try until she meets Malors. And then she's like, maybe that's the flavor I would like this week.
Yeah.
So good for you, Connie. Good for you.
Yeah, definitely
Um,
good for her.
yeah.
So the Victorians were benefiting from the Industrial Revolution. At least the growing middle class and the upper classes were benefiting.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Lawrence seems to view industry as something that physically maims us, represented
Yeah.
quite literally by Sir Clifford's paralysis, though he was paralyzed by being wounded in the war.
Right.
How do you think that Lawrence's view of this machine of the Revolution compares to the Victorian belief in industrial progress?
Yeah, no, this is a super good question, Naomi. When I read this, I was like, so smart. You're so smart. And I really think this does get at something central to what Lawrence is doing, but maybe something that casual readers of this novel would overlook in their pursuit of the other meaty bits of the novel. Lawrence sets the novel in the coal mining Midlands deliberately. So industry isn't just the background, it's a moral and emotional environment. And in one way, you could even kind of read it as a character because the pits and the machine, the emphasis on productivity, management all become part of this worldview that prioritizes abstraction and control over lived human experiences. I also want to be careful here, though, because Clifford's paralysis is not treated as a moral failing, and Lawrence doesn't equate disability with lack of worth. What he's critiquing, I think, instead is how Clifford responds to injury and loss by doubling down on mechanization and intelligence and ownership over land, over labor, and even over Connie's time and loyalty. So your question makes a lot of sense because Lawrence is asking what happens when modern life teaches us to treat bodies, our own and other people's, as secondary to systems. Connie's relationship understood in that way and read through this lens of industry, which I think is really enriches how we might read Connie's relationship with Mellors, because that makes it not just about sex. The industrial aspect makes it about resisting a culture that's normalized emotional numbness as maturity and endurance or duty as a virtue. And in that sense, industrial modernity here becomes part of the novel's bigger ethical problem. So it's offering efficiency and progress, but at the cost of intimacy and reciprocity and care.
Well, and that was something that kind of struck me because I had never read Lady Chatterley's Lover before you picked it. So
Oh,
this
good.
is my first time reading it. But
Oh, then I should ask you back. What did you think of it?
well, this is what I thought really is that, on the one hand, I thought it was interesting that Clifford had this life of the mind and he had all these intellectual pursuits, despite being paralyzed and, but he also had servants and a caretaker, in addition to Connie, that made life easier for him, which not all people living with disabilities have. But
Right.
he was trading this life of the mind for an actual connection to other people. He was losing that connection. And so Connie, she could only stand so much life of the mind, but she still wanted to connect with people, with that, not just the physical intimacy, but the emotional intimacy. And she
Yeah.
ultimately finds that with Oliver Mellers.
Yeah. Her husband, it's almost like he wants to forget he has a body. Yeah. He wants to forget he has a body and just be a mind because his body has failed him, is the way he looks at it. And so, and she's, supportive of him, but she still very much has a body. And these are young people.
Right.
Like, they got married young and he was in the military young. So these are people in their 20s. Like, you don't just stop having sex in your 20s. And
Right.
to expect her to do that is really extreme on his part.
Well, and she was, the book makes clear that she had experienced sex before she married him. So she wasn't
Right.
coming to, the marriage bed as this virgin. She'd had relationships. It also talks about her sister, kind of in the same whatever school they were at in Germany. And,
Right.
it was just, that was really interesting. And I thought that was a nice way of weaving in, how the Victorian era was changing, or at least, it wasn't something that was necessarily talked about, even though it was a reality for a lot of young women, that they weren't necessarily virgins when they got married.
Or given the time that not the Victorian era was changing, but that the children of the Victorians had
Right.
changed, that they had maybe, who knows? I mean, we have parents now that are much more, I know my rule with my sons was always, if they're old enough to ask, they're old enough to know. And so, there was no secrecy around sexuality in our house. We openly discussed it, and I felt that was healthier. So, it seems like many Victorians coming out of that era and being raised in that era probably had a belly full of silence and did not want to raise their children that way. And then with World War I and so many young people dying, that there was also the grasping after a sense of aliveness in the wake of war that was really important. So she's definitely an early 20th century, generation girl. And I also appreciated that he was clear that she was not, some dewy-eyed bride from the 19th century or the Romantic era.
Yeah, no, I just loved it. So Victorian literature is famous for what it doesn't say. Speaking of their, stomach full of silence, the euphemisms and the fade to black moments, that we see in literature. When Lawrence explicitly uses four-letter words and describes the mechanics of sex, is he trying to shock the reader, or is he trying to reclaim language that the Victorians had deemed dirty?
Yeah, it's another really good question. And I think the key point is that any kind of shock value in this novel isn't really about the sex itself. Victorians were just as sexual as we are. What they lacked until very late in the 19th century were socially acceptable ways of talking about sexuality, especially about women's bodies and women's desire. And I mean, in some ways, you and I know, and other women that are probably listening know the truth of lack of ways to still talk about women's bodies. Much more conversation now, for example, about perimenopause for Generation X women as we're entering into that, because our own mothers were very silent on the subject. And now we're all being very surprised by the decade of symptoms that we get leading up to menopause because no one warned us and we're not happy about it. That, that silence around women's bodies is another thing that sort of sticks with us. Even by the time Lawrence was writing in the 1920s, there still wasn't a settled or widely acceptable public vocabulary for sex. I don't know if there ever will be one, because that requires agreement on the parts of everybody about what those words are. But certain words and descriptions were emerging in medical and private contexts, and they were still considered offensive, improper, or obscene in literature and public life. And for many readers, like I said, they still are today. But when Lawrence is using this direct, sort of unvarnished language, he isn't just trying to provoke, he's confronting this long history of silence and euphemism that made large parts of human experience, especially female desires and female bodies and bodily processes, difficult or impossible to name. And I'd like to name here a book that just came out by my friend Livia Arndlewitz that's about pregnancy that essentially explores that point in Victorian literature. So her book, let's see, I'm just gonna make sure I've got the title right and everything. It's called Pregnancy in the Victorian Novel. It's really the first book-length study that traces connections between literary treatments of pregnancy and the medicalization of pregnancy and childbirth over the long 19th century. So Livia's book, I mean, here we are at 2025, and hers is the first study of that. Okay.
Wow.
So, right. So, there are these large silences in history that still remain unexplored. And I think the deeper question that Lawrence raises isn't simply whether sex belongs in literature, but who gets to decide which parts of life are fit for language and which must remain unspeakable. Language is power. I mean, Michel Foucault says that, and we other Victorians, that's the whole point, is that the ability to speak and name a thing is a power structure. And the discomfort his language produces is part of that challenge. It exposes how deeply ingrained our habits of silence still are for many. Rather than offering shock value for its own sake, it's shocking in order to expose silence, I would say.
Yeah, no, I think you are spot on about that. So, what's one concrete lesson or a final thought about Lady Chatterley's Lover that you would like to leave with our listeners?
Yeah, I thought really hard about this, and it's actually the opening line of the novel. Ours is essentially a tragic age, so we refuse to take it tragically. I think that sentence frames everything Lawrence is trying to do. He's writing in the aftermath of war, of injuries and massive social change, of the cataclysms of different kinds of wars, like that happened in the Victorian era, and he's deeply suspicious of the way modern culture asks people to respond to tragedy, not by feeling it, by managing it and being dutiful to it and rationalizing it or simply enduring it and gritting one's teeth. So his novels are a contrast to the Victorian novels that often imagined moral success as compromise. You adjust yourself just enough to make an unjust system livable. So you adjust in order to cope with the unjust, I guess is the way I would put that. But Lady Chatterley's Lover is more unsettling because it refuses that logic. It won't do that. It won't adjust. Connie's choice is reckless, but it isn't utopian. Like, it's a refusal to accept emotional and bodily deprivation as a moral idea. Like, I'm going to deprive myself out of duty. She says, no, I won't. And that's more than just language or sex. It's really why the book was banned. Not because it was obscene, but because it suggested that refusing an unjust compromise, refusing numbness as some form of maturity or rightness or righteousness, might actually be an ethical response to a damaged world. And that was more scary for people.
I
So
think
for
that's
me, I
still
think
scary.
that's true. I'm sorry, say again.
I said, I think it's still scary for some
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, this book is still extremely relevant.
Yeah.
And that and the lawsuit around it, like when you asked me what book, this was the only book that came to mind. I mean, I know there are hundreds of books that have been banned, but this book does so much work for problems that persist and for questions that we still as humans need to grapple with and for things that make us uncomfortable, whether that's reading a book that says something that we don't want to sit with and we don't want to think about, or that it's a book that says to us, you don't have to just do your duty and be obligated. And that makes us feel uncomfortable. This book does a lot of work that I think people can benefit from. Sure, it's got the piquant, sex scenes, and then that might be fun or titillating for some people. But I really think that was just a vehicle that Lawrence was using to make these much larger points about a society that was not functioning in healthy ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Amy, so much for that insight and for all of the insights that you brought to this
Of course.
conversation.
Of course.
Oh,
It was such an honor to be asked, and I'd love to chat with you about other books too.
yeah. Well, there's like over 500 books on my list, so we'll
Well, we'll have
probably
to
have
do it again.
opportunity for more.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to do it again.
Yeah.
I think I would also just add, I had sort of further thought about the unspeakable language, is that the discomfort of this novel makes a lot of sense. even though we live in a culture that's saturated with sexual imagery everywhere we go, we're still very uneven about language as a
Right.
culture, especially language that names bodies and desire and pleasure directly rather than through irony or euphemism. So in some ways, we are very Victorian still. And for some readers, Lawrence's words still feel blunt or jarring because they refuse to filter. For others, the offense comes from the fact that the novel centers female desire in a way that still unsettles ideas about propriety and privacy and control and whether men should get their pleasure, all the time and women should just get it as an accident, So I don't think that the takeaway has to be that everyone should be comfortable with the language. What's more interesting is that offense isn't static. It tells us something about cultural norms we've inherited, and the fact that these words still provoke strong reaction shows how persistent our anxieties are around sex and speech. And so in that sense, the novel really is continuing to do work it set out to do. It forces us to notice where our limits are and to ask who those limits serve, basically, is what I would say. And so that is, I guess, my final word on that.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah. All right.
Well, the next episode will be The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, which is a young
Exciting.
adult novel. Yes, very exciting. And as Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading. Thank you.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here.